Okay, so thanks everybody for coming, and we are just kind of getting ready for the school year still in some sense, so sorry for being late. We'll have the slideshow on the sidewall next week. It will look better and be more functional, and time is so precious, I'm just going to jump into it. Thank you very much everybody for coming to the second lecture of the year. This is the 5th year that the International Hempology 101 Society has worked with the University of Victoria Hempology Student Society Hempology 101 Club, with a student club on campus that does a number of things. And this is, again, the 5th year that we've had these lectures. And today, and in general, ancient history is one of my favorite topics, so I'm going to pack in as much as I can in the short time remaining. And in a couple of weeks, a lot of what I say will be complemented by Bill Finley, the owner of Hemp & Company, is going to talk about current hemp products. Essentially, today I'm talking about the history of hemp products. And hey guys, there's some handouts there if you want to grab one. Just getting into it. And in order to do that, I need to go back and talk a little bit about the history of hemp itself. I haven't had a chance to teach the first lecture. I usually build this week off of last week, and so I'll try to save a lot of the more history of prohibition in the broader sense for the next semester. There's a specific class on the history of prohibition. Today I am going to focus on the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, and the history of prohibition, though, does certainly go back far beyond that. But in the 1800s, hemp was very widely used. It wasn't known to be a cousin of the hashish plant, the strains that were producing hashish in various parts of the world. And so hash was certainly known of to be available in the Orient. It sort of happened in some sense when the Crusades started and hash was brought back from the Orient by the Knights Templar. But the history of cannabis in some sense was very obscure to the people of the 1800s, and they didn't know the relationship between the two plants for the most part. Although they did know, as George Washington stated in some of his notes in a diary, George grew a lot of hemp. He noted that you didn't mix your female cannabis plants that you were growing in the garden for your own use with the hemp that was being grown in the fields for industrial purposes. There is a distinction, though, that as we fear today, in some ways, if hemp becomes legal, it's going to pollinate all the good herb, and we'll have all this seedy, half-potent cannabis. So it's something that was known about in the 1800s because there were smoked forms of cannabis that George was using. But again, the full history of it wasn't known. But hemp in the 1800s was full tilt. For someone like myself, it would have been an amazing time to live. And I have a couple of books to show how important hemp was. I have the book that I wouldn't be here without, Jack Herr's The Emperor Wears No Clothes. Came out in 1985 and exposed what we call reefer madness. But it really is this incredible collection of documents and history, including this one picture that I actually had photocopies of when I started Hempology 15 years ago. And I was passing this out. In the USS Constitution, a great big sailboat, they had at least an estimated 60 tons of hemp on that ship, including the rope, because one of the first uses of hemp was, it was basically the cannabis plant, I should say, it was cut down or uprooted in the fields, and the inside, what we call the herds now, sort of like a cork, a woody pith. Okay, that's what the stalk of the cannabis plant, and that's important in a minute. Okay, if you get a big stalk, you'll see there's this cork. It's called the herds, and so the herds will rot. And so one of the processes that has been really important to develop has been to take the plant itself and cut it down and break it up. Usually you'll let it in the field in what's called ret, which is sort of a fine line if it rots and goes too far and turns brown and stuff, much like cannabis can do now if it's being grown both outdoors or with too much humidity indoors, or in the summer sometimes it will start to go brown, which I call retting. It's not really moldy yet, but it's certainly gone bad. Well, if we cut down the field, they try to ret it and get it before it had gone bad and when the fiber's still strong. And then you would smash it on some rocks or something, break apart the fiber. One of the first uses was probably to put on floors, because it would have been soft on the feet to put on bare houses. And it also is like antifungal, antibiotic, it kills bugs, and it's good for all sorts of things. So it would have been like our first carpet would have actually been the cannabis plant. And we would have learned to twist it around and make rope. So again, on the boat here, and I think the book, is the book going around, Gil? Yeah. Okay. There is not only the rope, but the canvas. Cannabis is the root word of canvas, and you'll see a lot of beautiful canvas like this in this day and age. They've kind of hidden hemp now. Like linen, for example, is hemp, but they just don't call it that here because Asians like making a lot of linen and selling it, and if they called it hemp, North Americans wouldn't buy it, right? So hemp's been a part of our economy for a very long time, really important stuff, and the strongest sail that they could make was made out of hemp. And a lot of that was developed actually in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands were really good traders and they were able to grow and develop their own hemp industry where it wasn't like being raided by these armies from outside of their country very often. I don't know the full history of the Netherlands, but I think that they've been relatively insulated from attack and have gone and taken over all sorts of other parts of the world at times. And part of that was because they had this just amazing hemp industry, like all the windmills and all this stuff. Like they were pumping out canvas and hemp rope as fast as they could and putting it on their sailboats, because it was the longer your stuff lasted, and back in what we would call the day of the 1800s, the more successful your ventures would be. And so having a good line of hemp in the 1800s was critical for your navy, for your merchants, and all this stuff. And the clothing of the sailors would have been all made out of hemp as well. They would have had hemp seed to eat. Jack demonstrates in that book very well how important hemp was to the navy and merchant ships. And even talking about this here, it's again unfortunate you won't be able to see all the details of some of these things, but in a way the Wild West might not have been settled as quickly if it weren't for the canvas that was used on virtually all of the covered wagons back in the day. And I'll stop saying back in the day, but certainly hemp was critical. I have a book here called The Reign of Law, a tale of the Kentucky hemp fields. And there's some amazing pictures and stories of hemp in the 1800s before there were any real restrictions on it at all. I'm going to pass Gail around with it. It's over 100 years old, so I don't really want people fumbling through it and stuff. And you'll have to try and get an angle on the picture in this darkness. But you can see here people in the field with these plants about twice their height, with these huge knives just hacking down the plant and harvesting it and leaving it in the fields. I almost want to get more light so you guys can see that too, even for a minute here. It's an amazing picture. This is frustrating anyway. I'll go through the slides before the end. Well, this picture here is better than any slide I have, I think. So.
That comes out really good on this.
Okay, you can see that one. Oh, good enough.
Off the screen.
And so, anyway, hemp was really hard to process. It was very strong fiber, really hard on equipment. In the 1800s, they were getting into cotton, developing all these processes and ways of producing and growing cotton products. Growing cotton and producing cotton products. So they're developing pesticides, fertilizers, and all these chemicals to make cotton grow better and make it look better and stuff like that. But they just weren't having much success with hemp. In fact, Thomas Jefferson was one of many people who was always trying to make the ultimate machine that could go into the field, cut the plant down, break it up right away so that the fiber would be separate from the herds, and then come out with really soft fiber and the herd. The herd was at the time just used for, say, like bedding and horse stables and stuff like that. It didn't have many industrial purposes. And so there was, stiff competition for coming up with softer and softer fibers and faster equipment, right? It was 1800s, so the industrial era was really taking root. And, these, the Wall Street bankers and stuff were looking for plants and commodities that they could develop and control, right? And so, if you want to switch to the next one here, actually, James.
There's a whole bunch of plants here that were in 1812 the most commercially important, and you'll see hemp is up there with maize or corn and coffee and cotton and vanilla and tea. Through the 1800s, because it was becoming more expensive to harvest and harder, right? Like after slaves were no longer kept in captivity to perform the will of their captors, it was really hard to find people that would go into a field and cut these plants down. And so it was becoming more expensive, and there's all sorts of other issues I don't even have time to get into. I think next semester I do the history of hemp, so I'll try and save a lot of this for that. But it's important to understand the build-up towards the elimination of hemp from the marketplace, because what happened was in 1815, the first thing that happened was, I think in 1815, the U.S. government came out with a bulletin, the Department of Agriculture, that claimed 1 acre of hemp could grow as much fiber as it took to produce with trees on 4 acres. So there was, not full comparisons with all other plants out there, but the fact that hemp was, 4 times better at producing essentially biomass and good fiber, it meant that while it might be cheaper to just go and cut down trees, ultimately per square foot, hemp was a much more valuable crop if you look at trees as a crop, which I don't like to. In the next year, the herds, or the woody pith, were turned into paper for the very first time, which is critical. It was all the old paper you hear about, the Chinese made paper thousands of years ago. And we're going to probably do that sooner or later here ourselves as an experiment, because you just got to chop up some plants and you get some water, and like people are making paper out here in the coast all the time with various plants and flowers and things like that, and you just got to get a silk screen and dry it out on a silk screen and you got paper. It's really easy to make it with the fiber, but when they made it with the the cork or the pith, the plant became a lot more valuable. The next thing was George Splitskin invented the decorticator, and it had been tried but never done the same way. And he was so successful that the fiber that he put for sale that was coming out of his machine was more valuable, I believe, than any other fiber that had been sold on the US market at the time. It was just really soft, really easy to use in machinery. And so George, I understand, was a really funny kind of guy. I think inventors often are. And the first people to find out about this were the newspaper companies, right? This one newspaper company in San Diego printed a small story about this new hemp machine, blah, blah, blah. But apparently, the story is, I understand, George died under the impression that he'd signed this contract and his machine was being built in a factory, and one day it was going to come out full tilt. Well, nothing like that was happening. It seems as though George signed a contract with these guys who essentially intended on burying this invention, as I know many other inventions have been buried by corporate interests that were threatened by it.